Welcome to Trinitarian Bibles Disprove the Trinity, Part 1, where we're going to discuss several texts that all relate to one, Psalm 110:1. Let's get right to it and bring this up at the Bible Hub, because if you haven't seen my moral and translation superiority of the NWT, Part 1, the divine name, this ties in with that in a way I believe you will see can not only be used to effectively show most English Bibles today are morally bankrupt and translationally deficient when it comes to the divine name, but in many of those texts where they are morally bankrupt and translationally deficient regarding the divine name, you can also use those to disprove the Trinity. Right? So on one hand, these Bibles that remove God's name nearly 7,000 times are a disgrace. Right? Using them when they do those kinds of things is in one sense, something I wouldn't recommend. That's why I use the NWT more than them. But you can use those Bibles and their removal of the divine name to disprove the Trinity and to highlight the divine name. So let me bring up the Bible Hub and Psalm 110:1. We'll also get to the NWT in just a moment, but I'll cover that up. And let me just get it aligned here. Psalm 110:1. Let's take a look at these translations of Psalm 110:1 at the Bible Hub. New International Version. Of David, a psalm, the Lord, capital L-O-R-D, which, as we know, in these Bibles, when it reads that way, all capitals, usually in most cases stands, if not in all of them, for where the tetragrammaton or the divine name is. And so here you can see the NIV totally removes the divine name, and we know they did it for money and for tradition, like I explained in my last video. And so here's an example. The Lord says to my Lord. Now, isn't that interesting? Two uses of Lord in the NIV, but one of them is in all capitals. Obviously, there's a difference between that Lord and the my Lord. What does the capital L-O-R-D Lord say to the lowercase L-O-R-D Lord? Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. Let's scroll down. Same with the New Living Translation. Capital L-O-R-D, lowercase L-O-R-D. They'll capitalize sometimes the first letter. So when I say lowercase, I don't always mean it's all lowercase like the NIV. I mean it's not all capitals, okay? Same thing, sit in the place of honor at my right hand. English Standard Version, same thing. Berean Study Bible, same thing. King James Bible, same thing. New King James, same thing. New American Standard, same thing. All versions of the New American Standard, same thing. None of them are using the divine name. They're using the same term that's actually used in the text in the second place, Lord, as if it's in the first place as Lord, but it's not. They try to make that clear by using all capitals, like I just mentioned. Amplified Bible, same thing. Let's get down to some of the more well-known. Now, it's only when you get to the American Standard, right, like an older Bible, like 100 years older, more than 100 years, that you actually get them. You get a text that uses the divine name in the first instance, where it actually occurs in the first instance in this text. How about that? All these more recent Bibles, except for the King James, right? I understand the original King James is not after the American Standard, but the New King James, New American Standard, New International, English Standard, right? We have to wait until the American Standard Version at the Bible Hub before it's clear beyond capital L-O-R-D that it's Jehovah here, saying something to David's Lord. Remember that. Aramaic Bible and plain English, it does both. We're just talking about the translations of the Hebrew text at this point. We'll get to the Septuagint more in a moment. Contemporary English, same thing. Douay doesn't even mark off the first Lord with all capitals. Just says Lord, Lord. English Revised Standard, English Revised Version, Lord capitals, lowercase Lord in the second. International Standard Version, Lord to my Lord, capital L-O-R-D in the first, not in the second. Literal Standard, a declaration of, it just uses a non-phonetic form of the divine name, but at least it's not Lord, right? It's very explicit here that it's the Tetragrammaton. They just failed when it came to actually putting forth a pronounceable form of the divine name. So it doesn't really benefit its readers beyond noting, which is important, there's a distinction here between the divine name and David's Lord. Net Bible, capital L-O-R-D, lowercase L-O-R-D, right? I mean, it just goes on. You get Yahweh here at the World English, which is not the correct form of the divine name, as we've discussed. And then Young's Literal also does give us the divine name. Again, another older translation gets it more correct than all of these newer ones, including the NIV. Now let's take a look at the New World Translation, which the Bible Hub does not promote, and see how it reads in Psalm 110:1 through 111:1. The utterance of Jehovah to my Lord is, sit at my right hand, until I place your enemies as a stool for your feet. The rod of your strength Jehovah will send out of Zion, saying, go subduing in the midst of your enemies. Every time you see Jehovah here, or Jah, the divine name, Tetragrammaton, or the two-letter form, Yah, is used. Okay, so this is why when I did part 1 of the superiority of the NWT, I made such a big deal out of this, because when you're reading a translation like this, you don't have to wonder which Lord is which Lord. Even though, again, some of the all capital Lords might help in that way, but they're not even close to translations that actually use a form of the divine name. Let's keep going. Your people, right? This is what Jehovah is saying to David's Lord. Your people will offer themselves willingly on the day of your military force. In the splendors of holiness and from the womb of the dawn, you have your company of young men just like dewdrops. Part of this is David, part of this is Jehovah, speaking to David's Lord. Jehovah has sworn, and he will feel no regret. You, right? This is Jehovah talking to David's Lord, right here, and now right here. You are a priest to time indefinite, according to the manner of Melchizedek. And then the quote stops in NWT. David picks up again. Jehovah himself at your right hand will certainly break kings to pieces on the day of his anger. He will execute judgment among the nations. He will cause a fullness of dead bodies. He will certainly break to pieces the head one over a populous land. From the torrent valley in the way he will drink. That is why he will raise high his head. Praise Jah, you people. Just like Revelation 19, 1 through 6 says, I shall laud Jehovah with all my heart in the intimate group of upright ones, non-liars, and the assembly. That was pretty clear, wasn't it, in terms of what's happening here? All right, now let's take a look at Hebrews chapter 5, where part of this account is referred to. So we notice there what? First of all, Jehovah the divine name, right? How many Jehovahs are there, according to Deuteronomy 6:4? Jehovah our God is one, echad, one Jahoah. That one Jahoah spoke to David's Lord. Remember that. Hebrews 5:5-8. So too, the Christ did not glorify himself by becoming a high priest, but was glorified by him who spoke with reference to him, "You are my son, I have become your father," from Psalm 2. This is from the Psalms again. But then in verse 6, he jumps down to the part we just read in Psalm 110, just as he also says in another place, "You are a priest forever, according to the manner of Melchizedek." In the days of his flesh, Christ offered up supplications and petitions to the one who was able to save him out of death. And we know, according to Galatians 1:1, it was the Father who raised his Son up from the dead, gave him a spiritual body, after which he raised up his physical body on the third day. With strong cries and tears, he was favorably heard for his godly fear. This is the one David said was his Lord. As the Christ, not glorifying himself, but giving up supplications, prayers to the one who was able to save him. And he had godly fear. Why? Because he's just a man. The last Adam. He's not a God-man here. The Bible doesn't teach a God-man anywhere. It explicitly teaches in Philippians 2, he gave up the form of a God and took the form of a man. It explicitly teaches in Hebrews 1 that he died faithful and was raised up to God's right hand. And then in chapter 2, he became lower than the angels, who are gods according to Psalm 8:5 quoted in that text. If he's a God-man, he's not lower than the angels and identifiable with the men who are lower than angels in that Psalm text. He was just a man, everybody. The last Adam. The equivalent of Adam. That's why he had godly fear. He couldn't save himself out of death. That's why he had to, if he wanted to, petition the Father for angels. He didn't have a godly man self there yet. That was before and after. He's a man here. And as a man, he learned obedience from the things he suffered. There was a purpose of him being a man here, not a God-man here. That's why it says in a text we're going to get to later that angels didn't do what he did, not even Michael, because they didn't become a man until he did. And I do believe he was Michael. But when he was Michael, and interacting with people like we're going to see as the Lord of Israel, he didn't suffer like this, right? He didn't cry out with godly fear and learn obedience in that way. He was appointed and had God's name to pardon or not pardon. Exodus 23:20-22. All right, so you can see clearly, can't you, the difference in Psalm 110 between Jehovah, divine name, and the Lord at his right hand, David's Lord. Is that just Lord when he was a man? We're going to find out. But in the Bible Hub, Trinitarian Bibles, you don't get that distinction made as clearly, do you? At best, you get capital L-O-R-D and then lowercase l or uppercase L or lowercase l O-R-D. That's the only distinction. But it's the divine name in one instance and not in the other. So again, how many Jehovahs are there, Trinitarians? There's one. Deuteronomy 6:4. And that one Jehovah, which to you would have to be the Trinity, I guess, right? Because you don't really make any sense. But there's only one Jehovah. There's only one God, right? Trinity then. There's multiple persons. I understand you believe that. The one Jehovah is saying to David's Lord the things we just read. Now, and he's a priest, right? That Lord. The reason I brought this text up primarily is to show that that Lord, that's David's Lord, is a priest of God. That one Jehovah who's speaking to that Lord. Now, let's go to a text where Psalm 110:1, that one Jehovah speaking to David's Lord, is quoted. Let's go ahead and look at the Bible Hub first. These Trinitarian, morally bankrupt translations that destroy the clear distinction between Jehovah and David's Lord. Luke 20:42. Now this is in the New Testament, everybody. And remember from my show on the superiority of the NWT on the divine name, how I pointed out the 79 instances that I believe are correct, where the NWT uses the divine name in the New Testament text, because it's quoting an Old Testament text that uses the divine name. And all available texts of the Old Testament that use the divine name from the first century earlier contain the divine name. Look at this, right? So in the Psalm 110:1 text, look at the NIV. Right, here's Psalm 110:1 in the NIV. Capital L, capital O, capital R, D. Right, it's kind of clear. It's not really what's in the text, but it's kind of clear, isn't it? All capitals and all lowercase, or all capitals and mostly lowercase. That you can tell, right? You could show a Trinitarian there's one Jehovah here where they gut the name and use Lord, talking to David's Lord. So that Lord that David is with and that the one Jehovah's talking to, Deuteronomy 6:4, can't be Jehovah. Not in the ultimate sense. Right? We already know that the Son and the sons of God represent their Father. I've done several videos about this. We'll talk about it more in a minute as well. But at least here, right? I mean, it's not correct. It's morally bankrupt. Because you're not supposed to remove the divine name from the text for money or tradition. But at least here you get what? All capitals. And yet, here, where that psalm is quoted in the New Testament text, what does it show? Does it show all capitals like in the original source? No. How about that? Here in the New Testament, they're exactly the same. Even in the second one where NIV in the source made it all lowercase and all uppercase, here they're exactly the same. This is why Trinitarians are so confused. This is why they keep their people so confused. They not only fail to carry over the divine name from the quoted source, they don't even have the moral integrity to carry over all capitals for the first Lord. So that you could at least say, look, in the New Testament right here, that's where the divine name should be, at least from the quoted source, and therefore clearly that Lord, who's the divine name, can't be this Lord being talked about right here. We'll get to that in just a moment. Now, just jump over a couple texts. We'll get to the whole context in just a second, but look at the Bible Hub. So here, the Bible Hub in the New Testament, these Trinitarian translations, they have Jesus saying David calls him Lord, so how can he be his son, right? So in all three instances where Lord occurs here in this exchange between Jesus and the Jews, and he quotes Psalm 110:1, which shows how you can use that text to make clear the distinction between the one Jehovah of the Bible and the Lord of David. It's nowhere made clear here, right? It's all the same Lord, even in all of them. New Living, not all. There might be a couple. Let's take a look. English Standard, same thing. Berean Study, King James. King James, actually, again, we have to go to an older Bible translation just to get it correct, because these newer translations just can't get it correct. These older Bibles, though, right? New American Standard just blows everything out and says, oh, we'll just all capitalize everything. This is probably the worst, right? Because, well, I don't know, NIVs, they're both bad. Because here, again, there's no distinction in this verse, whether it's all capitals or just capital L and the rest lowercase. Right? They're terrible, the way they handle these things. It's embarrassing. English Revised, same thing. International Standard, same thing. Net Bibles, same thing. Even Young's Literal, right? Not even a little bit of a distinction, right? Capital L, lowercase l. And still, though, it's not how it was quoted in the Old Testament. Now let's look at the New World Translation. Let's go ahead and go to Luke 20 in the New World Translation. Look at this. It's going to be great because there's another point I want to make. Luke 20:42, NWT. For David himself says in the book of Psalms, Psalm 110:1, we just read it, Jehovah said to my Lord. Just like in the NWT Old Testament, consistency, perfect. Sit at my right hand. Distinction between Jehovah and David's Lord. Maintained, clear, perfect. Until I place your enemies as a stool for your feet. Now listen to this. Listen to how Jesus argues with this. He's quoting that. Jesus is saying to them, how is it that they say that the Christ is David's son? For David himself says, Jehovah said to my Lord. Verse 44, David therefore calls him Lord. So how is he his son? Right there, that is proof. Jesus is applying this text to his pre-existent lordship, not while he was on earth. Why? Because then he would be David's son, wouldn't he, on earth? He was born through the line of David. Well, if David was talking about him as Lord on earth, there'd be no point to this question. Because the Jews could just say, well, because he's talking about the Messiah who would come and therefore effectively as the Messiah be Lord, as David's son. But Jesus is using this to show that's not possible. He's using this text to show the Christ can't be David's son only, right? We know he's his son through lineage. He's arguing beyond that and saying, well, if that's all it is, why does he call him Lord in this psalm? It's amazing, isn't it? Because he's proving right here that the Lord in that psalm, not Jehovah, not the divine name, and of course, in saying David calls him Lord, in the Trinitarian Bibles that remove God's name, it's just Lord, Lord, right? So you could figure it out, but it wouldn't even be clear which Lord Jesus is talking about. But it is clear, isn't it? Because it's Jehovah, the one Jehovah, Deuteronomy 6:4, talking to David's Lord before he became David's son through lineage. And when did that happen? When did Jehovah call him Lord? We're going to find that out in just a second, but focus on that. Jesus is making plain that the Lord that David is talking to as his Lord is not his son yet or only, and not in that text. The text he's quoting, right? Just like he, in John 10, quotes Psalm 82 to show Trinitarians never listen to his answer. What he's talking about when he claims to be theos, right here, he's showing everybody the difference between him as David's Lord and Jaho, his God. Now, let's take a closer look at how David even knew about this conversation at all. Acts chapter 2. First, let's take a look at the Trinitarian Bibles and see how they read. Acts 2:34. We'll read 34 through 36 and compare it with NWT. Let's look at the New International Version, since it's right up there. For David did not ascend to heaven, and yet. Right, so he didn't go to heaven where God is, right? Where God and presumably this Lord is, but we'll set that aside for a second. The whole point of Acts saying that is to show that David heard this not in heaven. He heard it on earth. David did not ascend to heaven, and yet he said, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand. Again, morally bankrupt representation here, but let's go with it. Until I make your enemies as a footstool for your feet. Therefore, let all Israel be assured of this, God. How many gods are there, Trinitarians? There's only one. And we believe that too. We'll get to it in just a second. But what you don't understand about our view is that when the sons of God are gods, they're just like Jesus says in John 14. They're the Father to us. That's why they speak as the Father to us. That God that the sons of God are to us made this Jesus, whom you crucified, both Lord and Messiah. All right, now, is this saying that God made him Lord only after he was resurrected? No, that's not possible, right? Because, first of all, before he was resurrected, he was the Messiah. He was the Messiah since Genesis 3:15, foretold in text after text after text. See my pre-Christian evidence series for more texts that show God made the pre-human Jesus the Messiah. He came and lived as the Messiah and died, but he was already the Messiah appointed from Genesis 3:15. He was made the Messiah all the way back then. When was he made Lord? Well, what did it just say in Acts 2:34? David did not ascend to heaven, and yet he said, the Lord said to my Lord. Who is David's Lord here? Who is the Prince of Israel during David's time here? Who was appointed in Exodus 23:20 through 22 to lead the Hebrews through all those nations? The Prince of the army of Jaho, Michael. The Prince of you people, Daniel 10:21, Joshua 5, Daniel 12. Now you know why. David heard this conversation, not in heaven, while he was on earth, on God's throne, with the Lord Jesus as Michael, the Prince of Israel. That's his people. The nations were given, the sons of God were given the nations as allotments. Deuteronomy 32:8, the Dead Sea Scrolls, earlier than the Masoretic text. Consistent with all of this, it's only Michael. Even Jude says Michael was back there disputing with the devil about Moses' body. That's the angel of Jaho, the Prince of Israel, David's Lord. Jehovah, in the presence of King David, spoke to the Lord, Prince of Israel, Michael, and said, "Sit at my right hand until I place all your enemies as a footstool." That's why the distinction is so important. It shows that David's Lord could not possibly be the Jaho who's talking to him. And the only Lord this could be, other than Jaho, whom David is hearing speak, is Michael, the Prince of Israel, since the time of the Exodus at least. Jesus, in Luke 20:42 through 44 that we just read, used this text in Psalm 110:1 to prove that the Lord is not David's son, because he wasn't David's son when Jehovah talked to him according to this text. You understand? You see the significance? It's so clear. And it's even more clear when you put the divine name here, like the New World Translation does. Trinitarians get all of this wrong, and we get it all right. God made Michael Lord. He appointed him in Exodus 23:20 through 22, gave him his name, told the Hebrews to listen to him. He's not going to pardon. He's not going to mess around. He's going to lead you all throughout these other nations' town and bring you into the land. And he stayed there as their prince. And he helped punish them continuously to prepare them for his coming so that his body would be ready to do what he had to do according to Hebrews 5:5 through 8 that we read. These texts are so clear, especially when the divine name is in them. God, the Jaho that spoke to David's Lord, made David's Lord Lord, just like he made him Christ in Genesis 3:15 and in all those other texts that we read before he lived as a man and died as the Christ. Nobody makes God Lord. That's why the divine name is used in the first instance, Trinitarians, and not in the second. If David understood the Messiah to be Jaho, he could have simply said, Jaho said to Jaho. Right? Because you could just understand that as persons in ways. And it doesn't. Right? It does the opposite. It makes a distinction that Jesus then points to prove it's not talking about him only as a human son. And so what else could it be talking about? As the pre-existent one, Michael, the Prince of Israel, who was the only one who could be there with David as this Lord, guiding the nation of Israel according to the order of Jaho. Exodus 23:20 through 22. It all fits. We have a clear view. You Trinitarians don't have any clear view. That's why you need all this other stuff, and you take the name out to try to make it fit with all this other stuff. It's incredible. Hebrews 1:13. Let's go ahead and take a look first at the Bible Hub. But don't forget, God made this one Lord. The Lord that David said, Jaho spoke to, the Lord that Jesus said was David's Lord, and so he couldn't just be his human son. God made him that Lord. And we see that explicitly in what? Exodus 23:20 20 through 22. If God tells you to listen to this one, his name's in him, he will not pardon you. He's your Lord. And he was their Lord that whole time until he came to the earth as their Lord and Christ. There's no question he's not Jaho in the ultimate sense. They're distinct from each other in Psalm 110:1 and in Jesus' reference to that text that shows it's not about him being a Lord as David's son. It's about him being a Lord as the pre-existent one. That's Jesus' argument, just like in John 10. And just like Trinitarians reject John 10 and Jesus' argument, they reject this too. They even change the text so that you are confused. And that's why we have to talk about it. Hebrews 1. We could use this text in so many ways. And we do, right? I've done whole shows on it. I've done videos on the entire chapter of Hebrews 1 and most of chapter 2 in my Bible in the Trinity and Conflict series. So here in Hebrews 1:13, we get a partial quotation from the section of verses in Psalm 110:1, right? To which of the angels did God ever say, "Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet"? Quoting part of Psalm 110. And we know as Hebrews goes on, especially in chapter 2, this is talking about Jesus as a man. He became lower than the angels. So he couldn't be talking to an angel or a God-man, because a God-man would be higher than the angels, and Jesus as a man became lower than the angels, who are called gods in that Psalm 8 context. So we've already explained how all of this fits with the biblical teaching of 1 Corinthians 8:6. One God the Father. One Lord. The Psalm 110:1 Lord. The Acts 2:36 God made Lord, Lord. That's our one Lord. And the Father is our one God. Not the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, Trinitarians. We need you to stop adding anything after the Father, okay? Because that's against the text. Sorry. But let's take a look at some of the Trinitarians' favorite parts of Hebrews 1:10, which we've talked about explicitly. And we're going to talk about again right now in Hebrews 1:10. Look at the way they handle Lord here. Right? So here, the author of Hebrews is quoting from Psalm 102, 101. We're going to get to it in a second. And as I've explained in my Bible and the Trinity and Conflict series on this video, this series of texts, the Septuagint is different. It's not the same as the Hebrew text. And I'm going to show that even more explicitly in a moment. But Trinitarians will try to confuse you and even lie to you and tell you that this is talking about Jehovah. Like the divine name is actually used there. And in fact, if we scroll down here, look at the New King James. It capitalizes Lord. Like the divine name is here in the quotation. And same with the literal standard version. And the rest just use Lord with a capital L. So what's going on here? Well, we just read, right, explicitly, Psalm 110:1. Jehovah, the one Jehovah of the Bible, speaks to David's Lord. So they're not the same. Acts 2:36 makes it plain. God made that one Lord. We just read in Hebrews 1:13 that the author of Hebrews, who's writing this text in 1:10, quotes Psalm 110 and applies it to this same being, Jesus. We already know the first part of this chapter of Hebrews is explicit in distinguishing him from God, making it clear he's God's firstborn, the character of his being, the one through whom he made the ages. So what's going on here? Well, again, I've talked about it. Just watch my Bible in the Trinity and Conflict series on Hebrews 1, 10 through 12, and then the follow-up part on verses 13 and following. But look at this, right? So we know New King James kind of blows this because in the Hebrew text it doesn't use the divine name here. We've already explained how this is talking about putting things together, laying the foundations of the earth. The heavens are the works of his hands. Just like wisdom in Proverbs 8 is said to have done these things with the heavens and the earth in God's presence, after being made, created, begotten, as the beginning, the arche of his ways. Now let's go to Psalm 101. Let's take a look at the Bible Hub first. When we look at Psalm 102, let's go to 24. And Trinitarians might like to say, well, Greg, okay, fine. Like you've talked about, I'll get to in a moment. The quotation in Hebrews 1:10 that uses Lord there, true. That's not in the Hebrew text. It does appear to be a messianic application or even an originally messianic translation in Psalm 101 of the Septuagint 25, right? Because there it uses Lord, but not in the Hebrew text. So some Trinitarian might say, well, but Greg, verse 24, so I said, do not take me away, my God. In the midst of my days, your years go on throughout generations. And then it quotes the text we just read. In the beginning, you laid the foundations of the earth. Heavens are the works of your hands. And you notice here, there's no Lord. Right? Like in Hebrews 1:10, in the beginning, O Lord, you laid the foundations of the earth. It's not in the Hebrew text. But Trinitarian might say, well, but Greg, he's talking to my God here. And while we already know we can refer to Jesus as our God, in the sense that John 20:28 does in light of John 20:17 and John chapter 14, that Jesus is the Father to us, the one God. A Trinitarian might say, well, Greg, the context here is Jehovah, my God. So when it refers to him in verse 25, yeah, it doesn't use Lord, but it just called him my God. Not in the Septuagint text. Doesn't do that. Just like in the Septuagint of verse 25, which in the Septuagint is Psalm 101, it does not use my God in verse 24. The Greek text of the Septuagint being quoted in Hebrews 1 is totally different in those two key respects, making it a perfect text to apply to the Messiah because it calls him Lord, not the divine name. The divine name is not in Psalm 102:25 of the Hebrew text like the King James, New King James makes it seem. Nor is my God of Psalm 102:24 of the Hebrew text. And that's why the author of Hebrews not only quotes it and applies it to Jesus here, after just having identified Jesus in verses 1 through 3 as one distinct from God through whom he made the ages, and as the character of God's being, in verse 13, he quotes Psalm 110. And so when he's using the text from Psalm 101, 102 that he uses Lord in the Septuagint and not my God in verse 24, he's associating it explicitly with Psalm 110. That's David's Lord, to whom the God Jaho spoke. And Jesus said that's the pre-existent Lord who's not David's son. It really couldn't be any more clear, my friends. The Bible not only does not teach the Trinity, the Bible contradicts the Trinity. And even Trinitarian Bibles that try to promote the Trinity disprove the Trinity, even without the divine name. That's bad enough, right? I mean, it's terrible. But when you put the divine name where it actually is, you get it in Psalm 110:1. You get it in the quotation of Psalm 110 in Luke 20:42. You get it in the quotation of Acts 2:34. This shows right here that when he's being made Lord, it's that Lord. Just 2 verses later, after quoting Psalm 110:1, which says, Jehovah said to David's Lord, Acts 2:36 says, God, Jehovah, made David's Lord, Lord. Right after quoting it. Hebrews 1 uses a text that's messianic in its text, different from the Hebrew text, to refer to Jesus as Lord, and then right after doing so, in Hebrews 1:13, quotes Psalm 110, David's Lord. It's not calling him Jaho or the divine name in Hebrews 1:10, or in the Septuagint of Psalm 101:25. This is all about Jesus as David's Lord, whom Jesus himself identified as more than David's son, meaning it was him as Lord before he was David's son. And Acts 2:36 tells us that God, the one God, Trinitarians, made that Lord, Lord. Nobody, and I mean nobody, makes the Lord Jaho Lord. He just is Lord. But David's Lord, who's not David's son as Lord, according to Jesus in Luke 20, was made Lord. Talk about temporality. Now let's go to the ultimate text that I suggest you use next to show that Trinitarian Bibles disprove the Trinity. We'll start in verse 4, 1 Corinthians 8. So then about eating food sacrificed to idols, we know an idol is nothing at all in the world, and that there is no God but one. Oudes, Trinitarians. Just like the adverbial adjective in John 1:3, oude. Here we have it used as an adjective, oudes. No one, nothing, no other but one. So if you want to use John 1:3, just like we do properly contextually for the physical creations, Genesis 1, but you go way beyond that. Nothing, right? Not one thing. There's not one other God, Trinitarians, but whom? While there are those who are called gods in heaven and on earth, to us, there's but one God, the Father. That's the one God of the Bible, Trinitarians. You need go no farther. That's the God who made David's Lord, Lord. Which is why in that text where David says, Jehovah said to my Lord, one is called Lord and the other is called Jaho. And while that Lord, who is David's Lord, speaks to us as Jaho, Exodus 23, 20 through 22, you might want to read how God put his name in David's Lord, the one who led them all the way, stayed with them all the way, and who was there with David, who did not ascend to the heavens, but yet heard Jehovah say to his Lord, the Lord that shows he's more than David's son, according to the Lord. That one God is the Father. Your own Bibles tell you that. Stop adding to that. They then tell us we have one Lord. Well, who made him that one Lord? Trinitarians. We're told explicitly. We just read it, Acts 2:36. Even Jesus said it. It means more than being David's son. Which in Acts 2:34, the context of Acts 2:36, is what they're talking about. He made him that Lord from at least Exodus 23 onward. And after he was resurrected onward. Philippians 2, God raised him and exalted him and gave him the name above every name, so that what? All knees bow to him, so that what? The Father, the one God, the God of Isaiah, the text that Paul is borrowing from in Philippians 2, that would never be glorified to another God, especially in Isaiah. If you read Isaiah like I do, that Lord, who's made Lord, and to all knees bow as Lord, is not to his glory as Lord. It's to the glory of the one God. The God, that the one Lord is to us. John 14. Have I been with you so long? You don't understand? You don't get it yet? If you're looking at me, you're looking at the Father. It's not me. It's not my teaching. I'm not doing what I say. I learned these things from the God who spoke to me as Lord before I was David's son. So when I talk to you as God, when I talk to you as the Almighty One, I'm not that God, unless you believe he's the Father, Trinitarians, which you don't. I'm acting for that one. He put his name in me. Exodus 23. I'm doing what he says. He's my God. Revelation 3:12. So says the risen Son. All of these texts in any Bible translation contradict the Trinity. They disprove it. They destroy it because they don't even teach it. And those who try to act like the Bible teaches it get everything wrong when they try to teach it from the Bible. But the beauty for us is, since we believe the Bible, doesn't matter if the Trinitarians get it wrong. I mean, it matters, but we can go on. Use their Bible. Because even if Trinitarians get the Bible wrong, you can use their Bible to show what's right.